Let's take a look at the existing code in a little more detail, including looking at what navigation is, what a navigation stack is, what pages are, and the content that are enclosed within those pages. Open up Qt Creator and let's start up a new project. And this is the project that we're going to continue with throughout the entire course. And this project will be called Property Cross. So go up to File, New File or Project. Let's have an empty application. Hit Choose. And let's call this, of course, Property Cross. Now you'll notice your name can't contain white space. So just close that up. Hit Next. Select your kits. Leave it as desktop for now if you wish. And after you've done that, the app display name, we might want to put a space into that because Property Cross without a space looks a bit silly. And then let's call it com.imdev.propertycross. Obviously, you'll use your own domain for the com bit, the app identifier, to ensure that it's unique. Hit Next. We're not going to do any plugins. And we're simply going to finish. We're not going to have any version control, no GitHub, and what have you. And so, of course, we should be presented with the basic boilerplate code that we need for our app. I'm just going to close this live server for now so we can concentrate on what we've got here. So the purpose of this particular lecture is to explain a little more what these things are, such as app, a nav stack, and a page. You'll also notice that there are some comments here referring to a license key. So if you need to remove, for example, the vplay splash screen and things like that, and you need plugins, then you will need to generate a license that is related to your app identifier. And to understand how to do that, all you have to do is head over to vplay.net/license key. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, we have a declaration up here in our main.qml that is app. What does that mean? Well, that's pretty much shorthand for this is an application. So that one should be pretty obvious to you. And then inside of that application, we have something called a navigation stack. Now, if you've never done native mobile app development before, you may or may not know about nav stacks. They do exist, of course, in the desktop world as well, but they're not as common as they are in the app world. So all a nav stack is it's a bit of code, like everything. It's a bit of code that keeps track of what is shown on your screen in terms of pages. So a nav stack by itself doesn't show anything. But when we add in this concept down here, this item called page, the nav stack automatically knows about that page and it displays it inside or on the screen as you're looking at it. Now, if we wanted to add another page, what we would do is we would do something called pushing a new page on top of that nav stack, and that would stack that new page on top of this current one. So if you imagine, we now have a stack of pages, and that is basically what a navigation stack does. It keeps track of all the pages that it has in memory, or should have in memory, and it keeps track of the order they're in. And finally, it keeps track of whether that page should be destroyed, removed from the stack, and it should show the preceding one, or it should add another page and add it to the top of the stack, hiding the latest one. That is all a navigation stack does for the most part. Okay, so now we have a page. A page by default is something that's shown in the entirety of the view of your screen. The page itself contains some content. So you can define a title, and by default, the page will put that title inside of the navigation bar. So if we just hit the live button here and we actually run this, you will of course see the title running at the top main page. So that's what it does by default with main page. Now, it also does the same with Android, but except that's aligned to the left, which is an Android thing, and desktop, it's got its own function the way it does things. Okay, so we've defined a title for that page. If we change that, then it would update. We also have an image object that we've defined. And the image requires a source, So it needs to know where the image is coming from. Now this source doesn't have to be included with your app. So at the moment it's going off and it's looking at the assets. It's looking for vplay logo, and the assets, recall, are in other files, assets, and there is our vplay logo. But we'll just close that for now. And we're also giving it a position. So we're saying we want you to anchor to the center, that's the center both horizontally and vertically, of the parent. The parent, in this case, if we go up one level, is the page. And because the page fills the entire view, naturally the image will anchor in the center of that parent. So if I come back to the live server and I start moving stuff around, you'll notice the image always stays centered, no matter the size or aspect ratio. Of course, it does clip because we haven't dealt with that, but that's a whole different issue that we can deal with as and when. So that's kind of the very basics of QML. We declare an object, an application. We say that application has a navigation stack inside of it. That nav stack currently has a page called main page, or it's titled main page. And that page also has an image. Of course, there are plenty of other things we can add. You know, we could add a bit of text and we can hit enter and it tells us this text you can give an ID. Now the ID isn't shown anywhere. That's so your application can reference that bit of text. It's the same as image. You could also give your image an ID. And so if you just gave this an ID of, say, image, then you could reference that. But of course, image isn't a great ID unless you've only got one. So I'm just going to remove that. So this is basically how we declare objects in QML. So we declare what we're going to see on the screen. We give it a few properties, text, things like that. You might have font with text and what have you. And then if we just save this, we go back to our server, you'll notice that our text is up here, very, very small in the top left corner, right? So just because text is below image doesn't mean it's below image in the view. It doesn't know where it is. So by default, it goes to the top left corner. Okay, for now, let's get rid of this bit of text. Let's save the file so it updates our program. And let's open up a web browser. If you go to the vplay docs, then you will notice that you can actually read all about what these things are. So that app that we have up at the top here, the app object, tells you this is the top level component of a vplay application containing all other components. And if you scroll down, it tells you every vplay app begins with a single app component defined at the root of its hierarchy. Okay, so there's only one app component that begins our application. Then it gives you an example usage. So the navigation stack component adds a navigation bar. So a navigation bar is simply this bar up at the top of the application, and you'll recognize it from the various apps that you've used. And of course, if we look at navigation stack, it'll tell us all about the nav stack and the nav bar. Give us an example usage. The documentation's pretty good. And finally, we can look at the documentation for page, and it tells us this is a single page within an application. If we hit more, this type is designed to be used together with components like nav or nav stack to provide a native looking UI and user experience, because obviously you want the experience to be related to the platform that you're on, and that's what vplay does pretty well. So there are a couple of notes occasionally with these bits and pieces. When you start to get into developing your app and you are actually going to publish it, then I advise you to actually read this stuff. No need to read it right now, but read it if you want out of curiosity. Okay, so we have covered the app, the nav stack, and the page. And we've kind of covered how QML works. We're declaring an object, and that object has some properties like a title, image, etc. Later on, we'll see we can also add events to that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is understand how we get into this app. How does vplay know? Well, I covered that previously. If we go to the sources main.cpp, it is defined in here as set main QML file name. And so this goes off to our folder and to our main file. Now you can leave it as main, but you can also call your main file according to the name of your application. So we're actually going to change the name of the main file and change the corresponding file name in the QML folder so that we load that up. Now this is pretty easy to do. Let's just call this property cross main here. Hit Control S or Command S to save your file. Now this is going to look for this QML file, so clearly we need to change it inside of the QML folder. So let's have property cross main.qml, hit enter. Now you'll notice in the open documents it's actually saved that correctly name-wise, but in the projects view that name hasn't actually changed, and that's something wrong with the caching mechanism. So to solve that, just hit File, close Project Property Cross, and then File, Recent Projects, and open up your Property Cross. And you'll notice that it is now actually the correct name that's picked up. Okay, so I think that's enough for that lesson. We've gone through what an app is, a nav stack is, a page is, the fact you can add content to a page or other properties to a page. In fact, you can add other properties to a nav stack and an app itself. We've looked at where the entry point is in our main.cpp, which is defined here. And then we changed our entry point, just the name of it, to property cross main, reference that. And of course, if you look at your live server, give it a second to load, you'll notice there is no difference. We can switch between everything, and our application is working as we expect it to.